All right. It's midday, so we're live. Welcome to everybody joining us today from the United States, from Australia, New Zealand, East Asia, and other parts. Welcome to the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, where I'm speaking to you from here in Melbourne, Australia. Monash, of course, is on both Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung country, and the university celebrates the long heritage from those people and recognises their elders. Before we get into the substance, it's worth introducing Green Lab and NAPA. So, Anita, would you like to introduce us to Green Lab and its role within Monash, please? Sorry, Anita is the director of Green Lab, I should say.
Thanks very much, Michael. Yeah, a warm welcome to everyone from Green Lab. Green Lab is a hub for interdisciplinary and applied research on climate change and sustainability within the Monash Business School. So it brings together the academic disciplines of economics, finance, law, management, accounting, with the aim of working with policymakers, with industry, with civil society to really enhance the quality, but also the relevance of the research that we do here and support its uptake in the real world. And one of our research themes for Green Lab is optimal adaptation to climate change impacts. So this webinar today fits really neatly within that theme. We're really fortunate to have Michael Spencer working with us at the moment to build our work on climate change adaptation, and I'm really looking forward to this fantastic lineup for today, which is both international and very multidisciplinary in scope. So thank you on behalf of Green Lab to our panelists for sharing your time and expertise today. And I'll hand over to NAPA.
Amanda Mullen from the National Academy of Public Administration in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Amanda.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, everyone. I'm Amanda Mullen. I'm a project director at the National Academy of Public Administration in our Strategic Initiatives Division. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Academy, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit in Washington, D.C. that is chartered by Congress. We were established in 1967 to carry out our mission of furthering the field of public administration. We have over 1,000 esteemed fellows from all levels of government, including academia and practitioners as well. I lead work on our 12 grand challenges in public administration, of which at least 2 touch on this topic, including climate adaptation and building resilient communities. I'm also the program manager for the Agile Leading program. And formerly, I've spent 10 years of my career in federal government, including the Government Accountability Office, focused on natural resources and environment, and FEMA. So I'm really excited to be here for this presentation today. I'd also like to thank Michael Spencer and his colleagues for this ongoing partnership. Started a couple of years before I rejoined the Academy, but touching on these important issues that impact climate change. Also, I'd like to thank the fellows that lead and contribute to this work, including Dan Guttman, Mark Pisano, James Murley, Felicia Marcus, and others that I've likely forgotten, and others who are probably on this call. Just would like to say, if folks would like to learn more about the Academy's effort and partnership with Monash on that, you can go to our website, and I will include the link in the chat. And with that, I'll pass it back to Michael.
Thanks, Amanda, and we really appreciate the partnership and the depth of knowledge that we are able to join from the 2 institutions in your wonderful 1,000 fellows. So the topic for today really starts from the prediction of climate science that we're going to be having more extreme events. And this is starting to resonate. The 2025 Global Risk Report released last month at the World Economic Forum found that extreme weather was at the top of a list of likely long-term risks in terms of potential severity. So in other words, it was at the top of the list, and it was second on the list of short-term risks. In a sense, that reflects the problem, because we know there's a long-term risk of extreme weather events, but we don't know when. and as we've seen here in Australia and elsewhere, it's not unusual to see two extreme events really back to back. So they're very hard to predict. These roundtables really serve two purposes: to learn from each other in different parts of the world and compare what's working, what isn't. And based on that learning, try and advance our thinking on new and different approaches to adaptation and the unprecedented challenges of climate change. And I really recognise the work of people like Dan and Oren and Mark, who are on the call and really leading that. And I've been lucky enough to tag along. The first part of our roundtable today is essentially the learning part, and then we'll open it up. And our colleague, Kate Saunders, will be monitoring your comments in the Q&A. So we want you to contribute. Please do so via the Q&A function within Zoom. Kate will be monitoring that, and we'll come back and discuss those comments that you've made with the panel participants. First up, Ailie Gallant will set the scene for us. Associate Professor Gallant works on drought, precipitation variability and precipitation extremes in the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment within the Faculty of Science here at Monash. She's also Chief Investigator of the ARC Centre of Excellence for 21st Century Weather, which I think Ailie is based at Monash, but includes other universities as well. Ailie, we work on the premise that the planet is on a trajectory for temperature rise of possibly 2.5 degrees, some are now saying 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels. What is that going to mean for our weather patterns, extreme events, and in particular flood events?
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks for inviting me here today. Look, it's a really good question, and I think you are right. I think we are, if we're going to be realistic about this, we are heading beyond 1.5 degrees at this point, more towards 2 to 3 degrees. The question of how this is going to change weather patterns, extreme events, is actually kind of in some ways an easy question to answer, in some ways a difficult question to answer. Let's start with the easy parts. So we're obviously very sure and certain that climate change is happening. There's a lot of things that we can say in a very broad sense about climate change. Temperatures are warming, extreme temperatures will increase. It's very likely across the globe that extreme rainfall will increase, things like that. And those are the things we know really well. So the kind of very simple answer to your question is that we know that climate change will change the weather, and it's going to change extreme events, including things like flood events worldwide. But then there's also the hard part. And the hard part is really the crux of the issue when it comes to making decisions. And that's the reality of climate change in cities, towns, regions. And it's because the devil is in the detail, fundamentally. So while we know in a broad sense that extreme rainfall is very likely to increase, the how, the what, the when, by how much, how often, those kinds of questions, that's the much harder part. And unfortunately, as I said, it's kind of those important details that we would really like to know, but are also most difficult to ascertain from a scientific perspective. So I would say that we can glean some answers. It's not like we know nothing, but there are parts of the globe where we know less, and there's parts of the globe we know more. One of the more recent pieces of evidence is that in terms of extreme weather, particularly as it relates to rainfall, is that when we're talking about extreme rainfall increasing, we're really talking about extreme rainfall on very short-term timescales. So we're talking about events that might happen over the course of hours, things like that. But we also know that there are some places that we can say more things than others. That's great for those places where we're more confident in what's going to happen, but not so good for places where we're less confident. And just as an example, in the central and northeast United States, we know we've seen increases in extreme rainfall there. We're much more confident in what's going to happen in the future. But for example, where I am in southern Australia, there's still big questions around sometimes even the sign of rainfall changes in some locations. So when I say the sign, as in whether rainfall will increase or decrease at certain times of the year. So that means that there are some uncertainties that are really difficult to deal with, particularly at that very local level, around how extremes are going to change. So we know that they're going to change. It's that detail about exactly, you know, how much, when, and what that's the difficult part.
And we've got these sort of rivers of rain that people talk about as well. That, you know.
Yeah, so that really comes down to the weather systems as well. So some of these, so what I think what you're referring to is things like atmospheric rivers, for example. And I believe that, for example, California is about to get slammed with one of these. And this is the other part of climate change that's really interesting, because what we're seeing too is what some people might call weather whiplash. So this is when we get not only influences from increasing extremes in one type of extreme like flooding, but we're also getting other types of extremes. And of course, a perfect example is California. We've seen awful fires there for the past month and now extreme rain. And this is not unusual. This has happened in Australia as well. Some of you might remember back in 2019 and 2020, we had the worst fire season where a huge proportion of the Australian bush was burned. And then not 6 months later, we were dealing with some of the worst floods in history. And so these, what we call compounding or cascading events, this weather whiplash, multiple floods happening in succession. We know that sometimes this happens for good reason, but we also, you know, are still trying to work out why this happens and whether that can be expected to get worse in the future. So when we're thinking about, for example, weather systems changing, the reality is we actually don't know much about how individual weather systems will change, largely because our computer models don't allow us to model them in the way that we need to be able to say something more concrete. And this is just as an example of what our Centre of Excellence for 21st Century Weather is planning to look at and is looking at for the next 7 years. But this is only an area where scientists are really starting to be able to look in detail, but those are the details that we need. So we know that extreme rainfall, and we know that extremes will increase. We also know that different types of extremes will cascade, as I talked about this weather whiplash. But it's those details that matter, and it's those details that we still need to really pull out, which is where the science really is at the forefront at the moment.
So Mark's been doing work with a group who are trying to incorporate AI learning into, rather than, as I understand it, historically a lot of our weather forecasts were done the same as we do all modelling. You know, what's happened in the past, how do we project that into the future? Now those sorts of models are proving to be less useful.
I'm going to correct you on something, actually. No, we don't use the past to predict the future when it comes to weather. It's actually not like economic forecasting at all. So weather is actually forecast from physical equations. So basically physics, think Newton's laws, things like that. So we take you know, parcels of heat and moisture in the atmosphere, and we use them, move them around according to physics, and we kind of you know, turn those into numerical computer models, and we do it that way. And so in that sense, it's all based on physics, and that's what climate change predictions are based on as well, just using the model in a slightly different way. But certainly AI is playing a big role in trying to, I suppose, augment these predictions. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a weather or climate scientist who will tell you that they can replace these things. But augmenting is certainly somewhere where we're seeing a lot of power in being able to potentially improve localized predictions. But of course, the real issue comes when we get these unprecedented events, when we get these record-breaking events, events that we haven't experienced in the past. And that's where the physical models come into their own, because they are able to predict those rather than using what's in the past to kind of constrain the future. So I certainly think it's an area for augmentation of existing data, but perhaps not replacement.
Okay, fantastic, Ailie. So Jim Murley has been on the receiving end of a lot of these extreme events in Miami. He's the Chief Resilience Officer at the Miami-Dade County in Florida. He was a founding member of the American Society for Adaptation Professionals and Resilience Florida, and he previously served as chair of the Florida Energy and Climate Commission. Jim, as I say, you've been in the eye of the storm. What have you learnt about how you understand, prioritise and respond to these risks?
Thanks, Michael. And Ailie did a good job talking about, the background of the science and how we got there. A lot of people will talk about Florida as sort of ground zero for a lot of those things. And what rationale would any sane person have to even move here? Well, the realtor's response to that is, location, location, location. And that also defines our situation, what we've had to adapt to. And so it's going to be different than another part of the United States, different than certainly Australia and other countries. But because we are, a peninsula surrounded by water, salt water in the Gulf of Mexico, excuse me for calling it the Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic, and in the great freshwater wetland, the Everglades in the interior. So we're heavily influenced by that. We're a flat terrain. The ocean currents play a big role in what happens to our weather and our climate, and we occupy a geology of porous lime rock, which means groundwater is a whole nother feature that we have to look at in a specific way. And so that gives us, the cards we were dealt as hurricanes and storm surge and extreme heat, the tornadoes that are created in a storm event like a hurricane. We learned last summer how those can be almost as bad as the storm surge, and high tides at a certain time during the year. All those take place probably and exacerbate a stormwater situation and how we prepare. We had a kind of a existential event in 1992 when we had a Category 5 Hurricane Andrew strike the peninsula, and that led to a lot of improvements in the way we ready ourselves for the response to hurricanes, including really good wind codes and a complicated but somewhat successful state insurance program. But I'd say 5 or 6 years ago, we really knew that no matter how we prepared and how we learned from the science and how we improved in our responses, we needed to really focus down more on adaptation. And we kind of found a comfort zone that is not unusual. You'll hear it used, the term used a lot. We focus around using the term resilience, and drew on the 100 Resilient Cities program of the Rockefeller Foundation and many others that have found a way to use this as it builds on the work of emergency managers, but it gets into more of the general activities of government in general. And that's where I come from. I come from the structure of government and the legal frameworks that we have available to do these things. So what we have evolved and used in adaptation in our state in anticipation of having to deal with 2 degrees centigrade, all the other things that Ailie talked about, is really a layered approach starting at our state level and down to our smallest sub-community levels. The state has created a Resilience Florida program that has it funds vulnerability studies, adaptation plans, and then has a competitive grant program to provide funding to address the critical things that the communities, counties, and cities pinpoint in those adaptation plans. The state's is a large area, very different from north to south. So in the southeast corner, where Miami-Dade County, Miami is, we share that area with other adjacent counties, accumulating about 6 million people of the population of the state. And we form about 15 years ago, we formed the Southeast Florida Climate Change Compact. We undertook at that time and update on a regular basis our own sea level rise strategy. I think we probably didn't know it at the time, but that ended up to be one of the most important things that we do, because there are major differences that you can learn from the local scientists and our universities and our agencies. And we found that data that we publish is now clear to the common point that everyone uses as they add sea level rise projections to all the other cumulative events that they're dealing with. It also has a regional climate action plan, a whole lot more, but I wanted to focus on that at the local level, working regionally allows you some ability to weather the storm, if you will, changes in state government and changes in the federal government. The consistency that we can produce at that regional level, working with the private sector and, as I said, our universities is really important to the work we do. We're a county of...
that's a consistent message that's coming through
Yep.
internationally and from the work Dan and Mark and others have led, that we need to find new institutional structures that can operate at a local level, often cross-jurisdictional too.
Yes, and that same model, we then zeroed down to our county, which has 34 cities, independent municipalities within a county. So we have what's called Resilient 305, which is the organizing mechanism to keep that coordination going. And then the county itself, and each one of the cities will maintain that kind of approach to adaptation of the vulnerability analysis, the adaptation plan, and then securing funds wherever we can find them to update and protect the public facilities and other ways that we can protect the community at large from these events.
Have you had any success accessing private sector funding for resilience or adaptation activities?
I think the best probably example up to date, Michael, is that in the design of some of the new buildings, and we are still experiencing growth, and it's vertical growth. Condominiums 60 to 80 stories tall, on the beach, off of Biscayne Bay. There are very strong codes, especially for wind, but the default codes for flooding were really not sufficient. And what with that information base that I described, what we've seen is that in these large endeavors, they're going beyond the code. They're recognizing that in order to protect their own investment and the investment that's going to, ultimately come from the people who buy or rent in those facilities, they need to do more. So it could be the elevation, the flood proofing, the positioning of utilities, a whole lot more. When our growth was horizontal for years and still is to some degree, but when you start dealing with communities represented on this call and others, where you're going to significant vertical growth, it's a different set of situations you have to deal with.
Good point. Good point. And most urban areas are facing that. Here in Melbourne, we're suddenly looking at networks of 50-story residential accommodation. Jim, thanks so much for that. We'll keep moving and hopefully circle back to you later in the call. Just moving over to the West Coast, Felicia Marcus is a visiting fellow at the Stanford University's Water in the West program. She's a former chair of the California State Water Resources and Control Board. She served as regional administrator for the EPA, president of the Board of Public Works of LA, and a great friend of this group as well with NAPA. Can you share some of the better examples of action you've seen in California and how they've been driven? Have they been driven by clear priorities? We noted recently that California seems to have spent more on adaptation than any other state, yet it still has these ongoing disasters.
Well, that's the challenge, it's a big state and adaptation is the long game. It requires money, it requires better data, and it requires all kinds of new governance mechanisms and relationships, which are harder than anyone ever thinks to get together, particularly in a state that's tremendously diverse in its geology, its hydrology, its cultures, its governance system. So I actually think the state's doing a lot that's right, along with local governments who have, of course, been working on all these things, climate mitigation and adaptation, longer than states or the national government. But it's uneven and certainly under-resourced as preparing for the future, which is what a lot of adaptation is, competes with the now issues or the urgence or the disaster response. And, like Australia, we're the land of fire and floods and drought. So we have the trifecta of things you look at, and dealing with fire is different than dealing with floods, is different than dealing with drought. And they all are on different time scales and involve a multiplicity of actions on the part of government, but on the part of private sector players and ag and urban businesses. So it's a pretty massive human undertaking and not just a technical pick some infrastructure and build it. And so it's kind of tough, but I would say it's at the heart of what all public officials are pained by, because we can see the need for action, but we don't get the resources we need to do what we can see we need to do. And then some governments, and this varies between agencies, it varies between levels of government, it varies among people, are more comfortable engaging other agencies and the public and others. So it's at the heart of what I always call the challenge of ecosystem management rather than ecosystem management. And it's what bedevils, I think, progress in the environmental and natural resources world. And all too often, we only deal with the hard stuff, when in fact, it is about relationships, and most of the breakthroughs are there. I'll give you a couple of examples in the, oops, I didn't hit it, the short time that we have, and hopefully we'll come back to it depending on follow-up questions, how much time we have at the end, and Q&As. And to start, I'll start with California and then give a couple of local examples just for people to think about. And a lot of it goes back to Australia. A lot of the lessons and the messages that we've been working on as a state and locally, in LA in particular, come from experiences with our colleagues in Australia who dealt in particular with your millennial drought. After having the same more or less 3 to 5 year drought cycle for the same 120 years as we did, you ended up with your 10 or 12 years, depending on where you were. So at a state level, about 10, 12 years ago, Governor Brown, who was then governor and who had been governor 30 years before, and took a 30-year view of things, came in and realized that water was something we had to get started on now, because for us, about 30% of our storage is in our snowpack, and we're going to lose it. We're just a little bit of temperature rise. And we're going to end up with flooding in the spring like we've not seen in a long time. And we are the lands of floods. We've had the Central Valley flood out, and we saw Tulare Lake refill for the first time in I don't know how many decades, just a couple of years ago, flooding out all kinds of farmland and communities. But we once lost the capital of the state during a big flood. And so what we knew is we're going to have to deal with those floods, but we're also going to have to deal with drought, because we're not going to be able to capture enough of it. That we have fights over off-stream reservoirs, but that's nothing compared to what we're going to be seeing when we have these long. If we end up with our own millennial drought, we will have something even worse than we experienced in the mid-teens, and then a little bit at the beginning of this decade, where we had thousands of people's wells running dry, hundreds of thousands of acres of fields fallowed, etc. And so the only thing big enough to compensate as storage, because our variable hydrology, like yours, is putting it underground in groundwater. And so in about 2014, January, we issued, this is before the drought actually, based on climate, we issued a California Water Action Plan, which had sort of 10 things I won't go through, but it was an all of the above strategy to say, we got to do this. We got to do conservation first and foremost. That came from Australia and common sense. But we've got to deal with our groundwater management, which we didn't have. We're like the last state to have statewide groundwater management for a variety of political and historical reasons. And so the governor put all of his political weight on getting it passed, and we did. And the idea is we're now halfway through a 20-year time frame that we gave it, and what we have on the ground is a whole lot of communities working together like they never had before, forming groundwater sustainability agencies and getting that water in the ground when they can. There are issues with it, it's challenging, and there's some areas that are being put on probation because they haven't done what they need to do, but there are far more areas that are in action to capture, at least scrape off the level of floodwater you can scrape off and get it in the ground in any number of other ways. And that is probably the biggest statewide effort, along with conservation rules and a whole host of other things we're doing. Billions into upper watershed management, using our cap and trade funding, meadow restoration, again, to hold the water back a little bit more so that it can meter out in that timing, mimic the timing we got from snowpack melt to restore our reservoirs and our streams and the like, and get it in the ground. So there's a whole bunch happening there. And then at the local level, you've got, at least in Southern California, a bit in the Bay Area, communities on speed trying to figure out how to capture stormwater, which we can talk about a little bit more, using nature-based solutions to the tune of $300 million a year in a measure that finally passed, and massive recycling projects on the drawing boards, not in the ground yet, because Southern California is so dependent on imported sources. It's in a drier area, and it has more junior water rights. And in the Bay Area, you've got massive investment going in trying to use wetland restoration to buffer sea level rise. And it's a bathtub. It's not Florida, but it's the biggest sea level rise risk we have in California.
So you're talking about, so of course, traditionally a lot of these issues have been driven with an engineering solution in mind. It's pipes, pumps, dams, etc. What you're saying is that the learning is to, one, how do we use nature better and natural assets, and then how do we use people and communities and integrate them?
Yeah, and that's hard and takes a lot of time. It's not at all instantaneous, whether it's relationships across geographic and institutional divides, or engaging the public in the work of restoring land base and capturing stormwater on their own property, or banding together as part of a grouping, a multi-stakeholder grouping, to talk about which projects can do well. And the key examples that we have there are the $300 million measure in Los Angeles that's just getting off the ground, despite being passed quite a while ago. I mean, not 10 years ago, but I would say 5 or 6 years ago. But it's a huge undertaking where it also integrates equity in having community groups engaged in the process, prioritized eventually in the process, and on the oversight committee, so that we're actually doing projects that provide urban greening, flood control, groundwater recharge, and pollution control, as the magic touch of nature actually can clean up a lot of the urban slobber before it gets into our waterways. So it's pretty grand, again, inspired a lot by the Tree People NGO in Los Angeles, that for the last 20 years has been promoting the Australian efforts in that regard. And a lot of us have gone to see what's happened in Australia, successful funding measure for the city that's created these little miracles where you could see what you could do, leading to a huge county-wide effort. You know, the county is 10 million people, 89 cities, so it's a lot of work. You also at the state level have a lot of work going on with the upper watershed work, huge floodplain setbacks and restoration that get you multiple benefits, and even reintroducing beavers, which is like my favorite, where they had been banned for 50 years for being translocated and classified as predators. And in this administration, they've hired people, and they're letting them do their engineering thing to do the work for us and restore those meadows that create wildfire refugia. Again, have that timing benefit of slowing the flow of water so it can trickle down in a way that's helpful, and a whole bunch of other things. Is it enough? Are we done? No. Does we need a lot more money at the state and local level? Yes, and innovative funding mechanisms. But we tend to, we have the benefit of having a cap and trade program with warts and all, and some people hate it, but it generates billions of dollars a year that are being put into this because of the climate mitigation and adaptation level, meadow restoration and the like. And then we otherwise live kind of huge funding bond by the voters to huge funding bond, which isn't particularly sustainable. So figuring out more settled funding to help us do this long-term work is going to be really important. Some of the things that Mark Pisano has been working on are really promising there.
Okay, Felicia, thanks very much. That's great. We're going to move even further to the west over to China now, which of course has a long history of dealing with floods. One of my favorite lines I read was that Yu the Great, who was the founder of the first dynasty of China, was actually a water engineer, and what got him the leadership of the area was the fact that he said he could control the floods in the Yellow River. So, but joining us is Professor Huan Zhu, who's at the City University of Hong Kong, sometimes in Hong Kong, sometimes at the Guangzhou campus. His most recent work has been on megacities and climate change. And of course, the Pearl River Delta is one of the world's major megacities. So what can China add to this discussion? What have you learned that can help us better understand how we're going to manage the increasing number of extreme events?
Well, in China, we suffer from all kinds of disasters across the history, from Yu the Great, that was more than 3,000 years ago, until today. So we have a lot of this flooding, droughts, a lot of things with water. So if you look at a few years ago, so in 2021, we suffered a very big flood in Zhengzhou in Henan province. Actually, that's the center of Chinese civilization. Zhongyuan, basically, when you talk about China, Middle Kingdom, actually, we're talking about that province only in ancient time. And so that time, that province was suffered from quite a few flooding disasters. So one of this was 2021, so 12 people died in the subway, which was terrible because that was really unexpected that people can die in subway. And so if you look at it, so across the entire history, there was another big event in 1975, also in the same province, called Banqiao Dam. So the dam basically collapsed after the heavy rain. So then it killed quite a lot of people, about 20,000 people, I guess, got killed. And so a large number, I forgot the entire thing. But if you compare these two events, one was in 1975, the other one was in 2021. So of course, so the number of people got killed much fewer. But if you look at the lessons we have learned so far, we still have learned everything. But if you look at the early warning systems, so in the 1975, there was no early warning. And so the dam just collapsed and triggered a cascading event. Not only that dam collapsed, and because that event happened, and it triggered the collapse of a few dozen other smaller dams along the river. So that was the big thing. So then it's in the past few decades, especially in the recent decades, there's early warning system that has been used. In the 2021 Zhengzhou flood, there was an early warning system that got triggered. The Meteorology Bureau did have this alarm and triggered the early warning system, but the problem was seemed that early warning was not used very well. So the response to that early warning from the meteorologist was not very robust. So then that was one of the reasons why it caused so much fatality damages. So it's basically when you look at the entire issues across these years, one is how you can make sure that your science is correct. You can issue the early warning system well in advance and also in the correct way with more accuracy. And second one is how your entire social, economic, and political systems can respond to these early warnings and make sure that you can do the right thing. So another one is, if you look at all these lessons, there's another very big event in 1998 in Yangtze River. There was the flood was so huge that caused a lot of damage. Then afterwards, people try to understand why the flood was such a big thing. So then they figure out one of the lessons that was learned because soil erosion. So because China had been suffering from very severe deforestation problems. So then after 1998, they're trying to ban the logging of natural forests. They have this natural forest program. So across entire China, you cannot cut down natural forest. And that was one of the reasons why China's forest coverage increased a lot in the past 2 or 3 decades. So otherwise, I'm sure that a lot of people have heard about it. In China, there's a Green Green program. Basically, because in China, in past, a lot of people care so much about food security, so they want to cultivate more food, more land, and produce more food. But a lot of this agricultural land was on very ecological, very sensitive places, like the periphery area of the desert and also on slopes. So after 1998, all of this basically was converted to forest or to grassland with a lot of incentives, and the central government, the local governments will put place the money and also compensation for those farmers to give up farming and just let the nature return. And so with all of this, so you can see that across all of these disasters, something has learned, but of course, still a lot of more things have to be learned in the future.
Yeah, one of the programs that I wouldn't mind you just describing briefly, but before I do so, Dan, pick me up. You're the Chinese University of Hong Kong, not the City University, which is a different university. And also, can people, just a reminder about putting your questions in the Q&A, Kate's monitoring that. But the River Chiefs program is something that is quite unique to China. And that seems to me is about trying to engage more people in the management of these issues. Is that right?
Yes and no. So it's because all of this, for example, River Chief system is a pretty new system, happened in the past probably 10, 15 years. So the key idea is make sure that you have responsible people. So you have to take people accountable. So you have to specify the conditions, so the job, the duties of people, what kind of thing they should do, and the people are not just the random people. They must have the power to change things. So which means this river chiefs must be the mayor. So they're not new positions basically, but gives people gives those people already in power a different title, a new title. So if anything happens with the river or with a lake, with a bay, and so this one is river chief system is a name for a lot of other things. But also if anything happens like adaptation, like flood, like drought, anything with that to do with the water, with the river, and so then if anything happens, then the upper level government will know now who they will fire. Because they do fire a lot of these officials around to make sure that they'll pay attention, and because they have the power, they have capacity to change things. So then that will trigger the actions and to make sure that bad things do not always happen.
Okay, thank you very much. That's great. I'm going to bring in Ben Furmage here, who is the CEO of the Water Sensitive Cities program here at Monash, Ben, but he's also a former executive with Melbourne Water, to talk about the issues we have both here in Melbourne, in Australia, where we've recently rewritten the Australian rainfall and runoff guidelines, which have introduced consideration of climate change. And here in Melbourne, we're trying to work that through our hydrological mapping and into planning schemes and so on. So I'm not sure how much you can share with us on that one, but also you've been involved with these issues throughout Asia as well, through the Water Sensitive Cities program. So Ben, thanks very much. And maybe where would you like to pick up this conversation?
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and hello, everyone. Great to be part of a fantastic discussion. I think already we've heard that while the details of the challenges in each place are unique, the big picture challenges that we're all facing are similar, and that point around cascading and compounding events is a reality that we're really wrestling with. For example, here in Melbourne, we had our Millennium Drought, which was a 1 in 500 year event, and went for around 12 years. But within that period, we also had localised flooding. We had our worst forest fires on record. We also had an extra 1 million people come to our city a decade faster than we thought. And we also were trying to finance significant upgrades to the capacity of our system in the middle of a global financial crisis. And all of those things are interconnected and interrelated. So we're dealing with a much more dynamic and complex planning and operating environment. And it's also clear that the solutions of the past will continue to play an important role, but they won't, by themselves, they won't be able to deliver the livability of our cities, the health of our people, and the strength of our economies that we're looking for at a price we can afford. And so I'd just like to share 2 examples from Melbourne and one from Thailand that sort of illustrates how we can get better combinations of our infrastructure as well as nature and local culture. The first one is around Dandenong Creek, to the east of where I am at the moment, a growth area, an area where our sewage network was struggling to keep up with the increasing capacity. And I guess this picks up the fact that flooding has both quantity and water quality issues. So more inflows into the sewage system leads that it spills into local waterways, creating public health and environmental problems. A conventional response to that was to increase the size of a very large pipe, which was going to cost over around 110 million Australian dollars, a big project. But through good science, understanding the effects on the environment and what was actually contributing to the health of that waterway, that receiving waterway, through good community engagement, understanding the priorities for the area and being a bit more creative in distributed solutions rather than centralised concrete and steel solutions, and through good engagement around nature. Instead of $110 million on a larger pipe, around $15 million has been spent on source control for pollution, on nature-based solutions, so wetlands, providing water quantity and water quality improvements, and through community education and citizen science, informing the solutions for today, but also the operation and the adaptation of the system into the future. So the community as a really active participant in understanding risk and prioritising action, as well as delivering those actions. So that's one where the system is it's actually really cost effective to think about a broader holistic response. The second one is a really good partnership between public and private sector and smart use of technology, with smaller scale distributed systems being connected to the traditional water, sewage and drainage system. And it's a development again to the southeast of here called Aqua Revo, whereby new houses are fitted with rainwater tanks that provide a range of non-drinking water services, so taking the pressure off the centralised water system. There's localised recycling, taking the pressure off the centralised sewage system. And from a flood and drainage point of view, all of the tanks that are on each of these houses are connected. And they are also connected to the internet. And so when the Bureau of Meteorology forecasts a significant rain event, these tanks can be emptied to create space for local detention, taking the pressure off the centralised system. So a really nice combination of technology, creating and a more integrated and connected large-scale centralised system, and a decentralised network as well. And the last example is from Bangkok. So a really high-density, large capital city, where in the heart of Bangkok there is Benjikiti Park. And there was a big project that was to increase the flood detention capacity of that park. So as well as providing really important amenity services for the people of Bangkok, it was also a flood protection measure. Our work looked at this really important investment and said, well, can we add more value? And we noted that a lot of the flood water was coming from a highly urbanised area to the north, And so we proposed distributed nature-based solutions, green walls, green roofs, swales, rain gardens, smaller scale distributed assets, helping with flood management, but also providing cooling benefits, amenities, so that people have a great experience walking to the park as well as in the park. We also noticed that there was a big grey infrastructure, a canal running past the park, but that connects another large city park. So we've proposed nature-based solutions that could run along that linear asset, providing treatment and amenity and shade, and you get a lot more value from connected parks than you do disconnected parks. So in this, taking a precinct rather than an asset-focused approach, we get more value out of our large-scale and small-scale assets, and we can deliver a broader range of benefits as well as flood protection, but also some other really important, and we get more value out of the investment, so that every dollar that is invested in infrastructure is done in a way that it solves not just a flood problem, but contributes to a broader range of benefits that builds the resilience of the community. So there's just a really quick 3 examples talking about how better engagement of community, smarter use of nature, and bolstering the capacity of existing infrastructure can deliver value in new developments and in established urban areas. Back to you, Michael.
Fantastic, Ben. They were wonderful, really appropriate examples. I'm going to bring in Richard Savage now. Richard has spent a long time working in southeast Queensland on urban water as well as other things. Richard and I have known each other for a long time. He was an early participant in the water stewardship program. He has really been an innovator in many water programs. Richard, if we can't engineer our way out of these issues or solely rely on engineering solutions, what are the options that you've seen in your work, particularly in southeast Queensland?
Well, good day, everyone, and thank you, Michael, and fellow panelists. I'm speaking to you, as Michael said, from southeast Queensland, actually the Gold Coast, which is about 70 kilometres south of Brisbane and about halfway up the east coast of Australia for our international listeners. Firstly, Michael, I think it's very, very interesting, but also heartening that there are common threads through the presentations from each of these panelists so far, and I think that gives me great confidence that we can find a way through not just applying, as you say, engineering capital to solutions. I thought that it might be useful just to reflect on a few things. Firstly, the status quo that's typical to the area I'm in. In many of these urban areas, low-lying topography, legacy developments within the known floodplains, and infrastructure with inadequate capacity to cope with many of the recent weather events characterize many of the areas around here affected by flooding. There have been, in some cases, preemptive investments, for example, installation of temporary or permanent barrier walls in some regional towns. The application of integrated water management is pretty much business as usual now in managing urban stormwater. And there have even been, at a regional scale, improvements in the flood event operations of regulated dams. For the most part, however, the physical repair and replacement costs of damaged infrastructure and the economic costs to local and regional enterprises seems to me to be a recurring burden on the private and public fiscus. In many areas, flood-related risks have now been classified as uninsurable or assigned premiums that are unaffordable. This response framework neither mitigates the impacts we're talking about, nor adapts to this emerging scale and frequency of major weather events. So it's clearly unsustainable and justifies the need for an alternative approach, which is, a purpose of these roundtables that you're convening. In terms of governance, very simplistically, processes around here will sound very familiar, but these include warning of the likely event based on Bureau of Meteorology forecasts. There's activation of federal, state, and local government emergency response plans. There's statutory declarations in some cases, for example, evacuation orders. there's the mobilization and deployment of emergency response teams, ongoing event monitoring and public communication, the activation and coordination of repair and recovery efforts, coordination of volunteer efforts, sometimes activation of relief funding facilities, and the list goes on. The cost of these processes can run into hundreds of millions of dollars, certainly in recent experience in Australia. A key observation, however, is that we're not investing this level of funding into the mitigation or adaptation strategies we're considering. So it's a rinse and repeat scenario for every major weather event and represents, in my view, a significant suboptimal deployment of capital. I think this is stating the obvious. So key considerations as I see them, getting to answer your question, Michael, and again, I really love the idea that there's commonality in what the panelists have been presenting, but we need clarity of purpose at the local, catchment and regional levels to ensure that the mitigation and adaptation strategies we're trying to get onto the agenda for these extreme events are fit for purpose at the relevant geographic scale, but also mutually supportive, i.e. local planning should not be in conflict with regional scale planning. Secondly, flood hydrographs, be they associated with local catchment or regional events, are increasingly associated with water volumes beyond what is practical or cost effective to fully mitigate by increasing the capacity of infrastructure. Ben's example at Dandenong outside Melbourne was really good in this case. So adaptation concepts should therefore be integrated into the solutions thinking. For example, to amend local area planning regulations for new developments, to consult with community about what's possible with open space, consider the re-engineering of existing stormwater management facilities. So again, one of Ben's examples was the conversion of a canal or linear infrastructure in Bangkok into something that's more nature-based and can slow the flow, integrating detention capacity into the systems. Thirdly, the extreme costs of these flood events, and we do have the data for this, this is the economic cost, need to be unpacked to allow comparison of a repair and reinstatement scenario with programs that are including adaptation strategies and accommodating the increasing severity of these flood events. So whether the flood recoveries are funded by federal, state, or private capital, or from insurance claims, we are paying a societal cost for these flood recoveries. Costs of alternative strategies must therefore be compared on an NPV type basis with the increasing frequency of the repair and reinstatement scenarios in the aftermath of these events. Fourthly, again, this has been touched on, but we need to urgently reconsider land use planning decisions against the code-generated probable and maximum events. As we've heard, there have been revisions to design codes, certainly in Australia, that account for changes in rainfall characteristics being triggered by climate change, and some of these are significantly increasing the probability of occurrence of typical design events. So, for example, we might have a 1 in 600 annual recurrence interval event that's now actually classified as a 1 in 200 ARI event. Many weather events over the last few years in Australia, just by example, have produced the highest rainfall statistics on record, pointing to the fact that we should be considering the consequences of an event in addition to its probability of occurrence with far greater diligence and concern. So if we ask, what if the extreme event outside the design threshold means for our planning, we'll probably find a very different scenario than just saying, yep, we're designing this to the event and then we're going to say, right, we've complied with regulation and job done. The extreme event in excess of that happens, and we're left again with this scenario of enormous cost of repair and reinstatement. The vulnerability studies referred to by James would support this thinking. So that's the starting point to say, don't worry about the probability of occurrence. If it happens, what does the world look like? Picking up on some of the other points made by the panelists, we should actively research changes in land use management practice in all areas. So that's local, catchment, and regional. On a regional scale, as we know, agricultural enterprises account for the vast majority of land clearing, where conventional grazing practices and cropping practices can result in high rates of runoff and erosion, nutrient loss, and decreasing soil health. Regenerative practices are gaining traction with farmers, but to significantly increase the pace of change, state and federal funding is required through sustained multi-year programs to support them in this transition. Potential outcomes include, as we've heard, significantly increasing the absorption capacity of catchments, almost getting back to the pre-colonization stage, slowing the flow out of catchments in high rainfall events, and also returning ephemeral streams and creeks to perennial flow. Felicia and Yuan made reference to these ideas. Similarly, the extent of impervious areas in urban developments and the increasing rainfall intensities are one of the reasons for destructive consequences of these flood events. We therefore need to, I would suggest, proactively investigate and re-engineer stormwater management in urban areas, applying RWM principles, which is now common practice, and seek to slow the flow. One of the constraints to this is space, so this needs innovation. So how do we work within the existing urban fabric with the space that is available to us to mitigate these effects of flooding? It could well be argued, this is a point I make, that we have more of a land problem than a water problem. And we could do worse than adopt the solid waste practice of reduce, reuse, and recycle. And Felicia touched on this as well. So finally, my observations, I think, support the conclusions of Dan and Mark's paper. It's available to all. The 3 points of focus they present in the section on an administrative framework needed for transformational decision-making and action seem to me very apt. And quote particularly from their point 3, which recommended evolution from short-term financial government assistance to long-term multi-partner financing integrated into transformational investment programs at place-based scales. This provides a way forward for all the issues I've touched on, in this case relevant to the eastern seaboard of Australia. Thank you, Michael.
Richard, thank you. Fantastic. I'm going to keep us moving along, and Deb Knopman is standing by. Deb has experience both in the United States and in China, and she's a trustee of the Asia Society now, so she takes a bit of a global view of the regions we're talking about. Deb, and she's also a hydrologist, so that's another important qualification. Where do you think this conversation is going?
Well, it's been great, and it's been interesting how each of the speakers has, in some ways, played off of the others and hit on a number of common themes. You know, I think there is so much to gain from this kind of comparative discussion, and I just thought I'd quickly recap what the NAPA study from April 2024 said about next steps for case studies and kind of work off of that. So there were 4 points made. One was to learn about ongoing efforts of linking central government expertise and data with local planning and funding. We've heard about that. Second was the transformation of coordinating mechanisms. Jim talked about that, and Felicia as well, from looking more at cross-jurisdictional and cross-sectoral approaches. This is coming up in each of the cases. A third was which we haven't addressed, I don't think, in this discussion, and that is the coming to terms with these difficult choices about defending a particular place and the communities in that place versus a managed retreat, which is, at least in a U.S. context, a very, very sensitive topic, but that was out there in the report. Fourth area was how to, continue to cultivate or transform traditional management organizations to step up to the strategic demands that adaptation imposes. And I think Richard just touched on that as well as Felicia. I wanted to add a little bit to that, if I could, Michael, that I think there's some further opportunities here to be pulling out valuable nuggets from these case studies and to learn from them. And I would just say that, you know, we talk about learning, but we can think about learning and both learning about our own cases more by hearing and contrasting them to others. So there is that kind of reflection back on what we each are doing in our respective countries. But there's also the learning that comes with feeding new ideas into the mix, thinking of solutions, of integration of a number of different goals at one time. All of these things, you know, enhance our and expand our understanding of what's possible. So I think this is another, those are two values of learning. But the opportunities, I guess I wanted to just hit on briefly, and then we can open it up to questions from the audience, is there are areas of how the problem is even framed. What are we talking about when we're talking about adaptation? And we've heard quite a spectrum of thoughts just even in this panel, whether it's restricted to flooding per se, or it's a combination of flooding and water quality management. It may be also, you know, involving water quantity and water allocations. So, you know, and the way one frames your problem to be solved is, of course, going to drive the mechanisms in which you seek funding, the mechanisms by which you, you know, develop your plans and think about what your solution set is. And it's, Felicia, I think, thought, you know, nailed it when she said, you know, we're competing, these projects, these adaptation efforts are competing with the now needs of each of our places. And that means, and that kind of gets to my second point here, that there are a range of incentives and disincentives to take action on the scale that we're all talking about here that's going to be necessary. And I think that is the most challenging area of being able to understand and motivate what a massive regional or national effort looks like to bring our communities that were designed for another era, another climate regime, into something that's going to be robust against the future that we're facing. And so getting a grip on what these incentives and disincentives are for action, framing these problems in a way that are going to be compelling to the public, which needs to support this, to decision makers up and down the line, from the central government down to the local level. These are big challenges. I've often said that the governance challenges are far more difficult than the technical challenges. We can figure out the technical work, whether it's a combination of nature-based solutions and hard infrastructure or zoning changes, whatever it may be. To me, those things are doable within our current capabilities, though there's certainly unknowns. The hard parts are getting the wiring right, if you will, in setting up a compelling need for public action, public and private action that's coordinated. So maybe I'll just stop there and leave it to you.
Fantastic points, and a great point, you know, to really set us off on the conversation. As you say, you know, the technical stuff is all doable. it's getting the wires in the right place, particularly when they need to be reorganised. Kate, you've been monitoring the Q&A. Can I bring you in here and let you lead off with some of the discussion? So Kate is a lecturer in econometrics and business statistics here at Monash, but she's also contributed a number of articles on climate change, extreme weather and rain events, and a colleague.
Thank you, Mike, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I think that was a very interesting, all these people have come together to talk about things that we all have in common, and it's very difficult to find solutions to this problem. I might start we'll start with Alfred in the top of the Q&A today, who's very interested in the uncertainty of our trajectory and in terms of the warming that's happening. And I'll kick this one to Ailie. Will we be able to turn it around, and what happens if we do turn it around? Can you perhaps shed some light on net zero as well in that, in order to answer that question?
Thanks very much, Kate. Look, great question. I think the reality of moving forward here with climate change is that this is actually our largest source of uncertainty. The amount of emissions that we have will dictate how warm we get, basically. And there's actually a really quite elegant and simple scientific, I suppose, theory here, and that is that the total amount of carbon dioxide that we emit over since the Industrial Revolution, for example, is directly proportional to the amount of warming we get. So to answer the question of when we will get to 2.5, the short answer is that depends entirely on how much carbon we emit. And so if we lower emissions rapidly, we are, perhaps even much less likely to reach it, or if we do reach it, it won't be till the end of the 21st century. But if we don't reduce emissions rapidly, then we will reach it a lot more quickly. Under a very high emission scenario, this may be towards the middle of this century. And so that actually has quite a simple answer. It just depends on how much we emit. The question of net zero, though, and this is a really interesting one for scientists because, we're starting to look further into this, and the reality of reaching net zero and even going further and reducing emissions further so that we go backwards is also an interesting one from the climate perspective, because the reality is we've only kind of looked at the upward trajectory so far. We have looked a lot less at the downward trajectory. And while temperatures might reduce, there is still a lot of questions around exactly how the climate will change on the way backwards. And it may not be as simple as what goes up must come down. Things may change in ways that are still unexpected. And so I think that's still a very open question and something that scientists are really looking into at the moment.
Thanks, Ailie. I think perhaps the next question we might like to chat about is this idea of the cost of resilience or the cost of adaptation, and specifically prioritizing investments around things that can help us be sustainable in terms of our energy, our water security, our food security going forward, and perhaps choosing this balance of what we invest in. I think, Ben, you touched a little bit upon this in your talk about choosing where to invest, also Felicia. And Richard, would anybody like to comment about these costs of resilience and perhaps pivoting away from some of our infrastructure-based into more nature-based solutions?
Maybe I could offer a few comments just to get the discussion going. And I guess I wanted to pick up on the point that Debra made around the framing of the problem and making sure that, like, if we frame the problem slightly differently, we can open up a whole suite of broader options. And so, for example, in terms of infrastructure, we're starting to transition from focusing on the assets that do one thing really well transfer water, treat water, or a road that transfers people in cars, or an electricity system that sort of focuses on moving electrons around, to starting to think about moving economies of scope. How do our infrastructure investments make multiple contributions to multiple challenges and mitigation of multiple risks? So moving from one asset doing one thing well, economies of scale, to more portfolios of solutions that deliver economies of scope. And I think it's just understanding the cost, benefits and risks of the different options. So in terms of nature-based solutions, on the one hand, they are very flexible, they're very scalable, so you can implement them in piecewise ways and learn from each of your stages. And they also can be done in a way that sort of celebrates and celebrates local culture, but also adds a much broader range of benefits. On the flip side, they are open systems, so there's quite often more uncertain. They're a little bit more complex. So, for example, when you operate a pipe and a pump, it's a little bit more straightforward than trying to operate a natural like manage a natural ecosystem. And they're new. And so there's a little bit of distrust in how do we get better integration of these new ways of operating with tried and true traditional assets. So again, I think the costs are sometimes uncertain, but I think the costs of inaction and the costs of just doing what we've always done are becoming increasingly clear. So it's a relatively easy decision to make to try and do things in a better way.
I think Felicia, yeah, go on.
Yeah. No, quick. I mean, there's too much I could say about this, so I'll just say a couple things. I mean, I think what Ben said is spot on. I also think it's a really tough lift because everybody's budgets are in silos and all of those things. And, you know, in many cases, it takes years of conversation and different people stepping in to figure out how to get folks to see that we can all spend our scarce local dollars, for example, together to do something that ultimately will cost us less than doing it separately. It's very complicated. I mean, there's also the need for a greater appreciation of the need to invest in these things because the cost of inaction is so high. And LA commissioned a report from the Luskin Center. One of my colleagues on an EPA team has done some to show, yeah, you're going to have to spend X billion dollars to do this, but if you don't do this, you're going to have $5 billion worth of damage. And that is still a hard sell, but you can sell that to the public. The other thing is the diversification of nature-based solutions have some benefits in that you can recover from disruption faster. And if you do distributed microgrids, for example, in energy, you don't have to trip the whole grid. And so there's bigger as better doesn't always work, but you can't go all local. So that it becomes even more complicated, and it depends on where you are and what the circumstances are. But figuring out, for example, how to talk about water and energy in the same breath, really hard for people culturally, but really important, whether you're talking about data center, water and energy use, or whatever, where everyone has to adapt. So I just think we need to spend more time helping economists do the kind of quantification that will help public officials make these better, more resilient, more recoverable decisions and feel they have some data to have their back.
Yeah, I can see that both Richard and James would like to add to that. But maybe, yeah, so I'll pass over to Richard now to see his thoughts on things.
Yes, thanks, Kate, and sorry, James, I got in before you there. Yeah, I think part of this is that we seem to hide away from the post-event accounting, and there's right now in Australia, the kind of far northeastern sector has had 2 weeks of record rainfall. Many of the areas have recorded their highest ever February rainfall in the first 9 days of the month, or what was 9 days of the month. Some stations, the highest ever event, so that's sustained event rainfall. So the statistics are significant. The impacts are exactly as you'd imagine: destruction of civil infrastructure, and vast damage to commercial and private property. So, okay, what do? We respond in the way, there are cleanups underway, we're repairing infrastructure, but what we need to do is account for this cost, and so that we know what we're dealing with. And I can tell you, unfortunately for the Australian context, and it's probably similar everywhere, there's a lot of kind of embedded built form here. So these are towns and related infrastructure that have been developed, 100 years ago. Very, very difficult to kind of take all of this and suddenly make it resilient to the sorts of events that we're talking about. But I think one of the starting points is to understand where the money's coming from. So this means we have to talk to the insurance sector, because they're bearing the brunt of both public and private sector claims on damage repair, to the point where they say, that's it, we're done, we're not insuring you ever again. But what does this cost? And once we understand the extent of the deployment of capital, as I referred to it, we can start to motivate for change in both state and local government regulations, planning policies, all of the catchment, nature-based regenerative type work in open space that's leading to these high rates of runoff. All of that work can then find a place. But I think the starting point is to really recognize that this cycle of hundreds of millions of dollars every time, and in some cases it will be into the billions of dollars. At some point, that pool of funding is going to dry up, and if we haven't changed our systems by then we're in a heap of trouble. I'll stop it there.
Thank you, Richard. I'm interested to hear what you think about that, James. And part of the reason I went to you second then is because we have another question in the chat from Wurrung country about how private industry is engaging with adaptation efforts and these barriers to engaging these companies or investors. And you talked a lot about this idea in Miami of location, 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 and people being in areas that perhaps are not particularly insurable. And that seems to be a place where we could be having a more coupled effort in terms of driving development or seeing change in land use. Perhaps you can comment on those things for us.
Yeah, when I raised my hand, it was to focus on the issue of trying to make these investments, either public or private, in a pre-disaster mode, either a structural change or even nature-based. We have created over the years at the federal and state and local level just a spaghetti menu of permitting, and it's making it. They're built around protecting certain values, all of which many of us would feel continue to need to be protected. But they weren't created at different times anticipating the changes that we have all been talking about. If you do work with the Corps of Engineers and try to do a feasibility study about any intervention in the water, you can double or triple the cost of the feasibility study just depending on how much permitting they anticipate when they actually get around to constructing the project. And if we don't deal with that issue now, then you get into the mode of after the storm, where the pressure's on to just remove the permitting completely. And I only can read about what I see in California, but we've experienced it also in Florida. And so you're going to get results that you don't intend, even because of the need to move quickly in a post-disaster mode. Insurance adds a very complex set of criteria on top of all these other things we've been talking about. And I understand you're going to have another roundtable, which I agree with the other speakers. These are very valuable. The insurance programs need a lot more sensitivity, at least in our case, to recognize when governments are attempting to intervene pre-disaster to lessen loss and to shift risk. If you're familiar in the States with the community rating system that the federal flood insurance program uses, without getting into the details, that's a mechanism that allows the National FEMA program to acknowledge these pre-disaster interventions, leading to a reduction in flood insurance only. That just simply doesn't exist for private home insurance and hurricane insurance. We can't get as in the black boxes, and you can't make those adjustments. And that just without that incentive of allowing that to work and get a commensurate financial reward to the ratepayers, it's just that more difficult. Thank you.
Thanks, James. I can see, Mark, that you've got your hand up there that you'd like to add to that potentially.
Yes, the last two speakers, I think, put their hands around, I began to describe how we get our hands around this issue. And that is the issue of cost, resources, where does it come from, and the risks associated with that, with those costs. And you see that very clearly. We're seeing that almost in black and white terms with what has hit us in the last month. And that is the cost, the overwhelming cost, and the difficulty of dealing with that cost is going to be is confronting our elected officials, and whether and how they respond. I think to the enormous cost and the negative impact that it's had on so many individuals is going to, I think, will determine whether or not there's enough of incentive to deal with one issue that has been touched on in the course of the discussion, and that's the issue of silos. And I'm going to say silos in science, and silos in programs, and silos in institutions. And Deb, you put your finger on it, and that is, how do we frame it so we can get rid of the silos? I'm also going to suggest in the science area, Ailie, you're right on weather forecasting, but when it comes to climate change adaptation and long-term forecasting, it's the integration of all the sciences that are needed. Michael, I would suggest that be a subject that we really put on the table. And if we don't get a better understanding of the granular impacts so that we can deal with risks, we're not going to have insurance. The leading people, the business people I know in this country, I won't name names right now, but they said in 10 years you will not have insurance because it can't stay in the market. We're facing the same issue that we faced 100 years ago in the United States, that the insurance industry vacated the premise, and out of that whole discussion, zoning got developed. With respect to what we're confronting, the question won't, I think the evolution won't be zoning, but Deb, it'll be, how do we take your framing and how do we get institutions, in fact, to get out of their silos? And I think that's going to come because people are going to put pressure on their political leaders in this country. Ben, I don't quite, you in China, I'm not quite sure what that dynamic will be, but I don't think the political leaders can sustain, based on what I'm seeing in our southern part of our state. I don't think our political leaders quite have their hands around how they're going to, and I have come to the conclusion, without political leadership or institutional leadership, you don't make the kind of change that the climate is making to our physical environment. We need political leadership to do it. So I would just put on the table, how do we get rid of silos across the board? Felicia, you were a perfect descriptor of the incredible siloed work we've done in California. And it's now becoming one of our problems.
Thank you, Mark, very much for that. I think that I was hoping to get back to Debra's point at the end of the chat, and you've led me there naturally. This idea that actually maybe we have some of these scientific answers, but we're not necessarily seeing them translated into governance. And then there's also this issue of scalability and, if these all solutions need to be very localized, very regionally based, then if you have larger governance structures, how do they work to see the impacts and change we need on a local level? It's a very, very tricky problem.
Can I make just one other suggestion, Kate? And that is the issues that we're dealing with are place-based issues. And I think we've got to start with the issue of place. And to start with the discussion of what national governments and policies are going to do, I think is the wrong point of departure.
Yes.
I mean, how we get down to the places that are impacted and how the places that are impacted, because people are going to get to those political leaders. They won't be in this country, they won't be in office very long if they don't come forth with real solutions. And it's furthermore, it's at the place where you can get the kind of integration that you can't get in policy development.
Yes, it's a very tricky issue. Did you want to tack onto that, Debra?
No, I'm with Mark on that. I mean, I think it's not so much an either or. You need to see change at multiple levels. You know, I often use the Louisiana example after Hurricane Katrina as a case where the state stepped up to improve its own capacity to understand both its risk and then what its choices are, develop a plan. And it did that then because they knew the funding was going to need to come from the federal government. And they sort of adapted to some extent to work with multiple funding streams coming out of the federal government. But, you know, Mark is absolutely right that this has to be coming from the places upward. But there needs to be understanding and receptivity at the federal level. That's clearly where money is coming from, and it's a real bottleneck right now in the United States context to have FEMA, the Housing and Urban Development Department, the Corps of Engineers, you know, so many different agencies, each with their own rules, EPA, all wanting to see funding proposals just in their lanes. None of them are capable of handling an integrated proposal coming out of a local or regional government. And until we find a way to break through that, it doesn't matter if you're working well at the local level and you can't break that ceiling at the federal level. So we have work to do on both ends.
Thanks, Debra.
I
Sorry, I have gone over time. I just wanted to ask if you had any final thoughts before I hand it back over to you, Mike.
Thanks. We better wrap it up because we've sort of promised people we'll do it in 90 minutes, but we'll be back again in about a month, pursuing this theme of risk and insurance. So we've tentatively scheduled risk and insurance. Yes, I'm coming to you, Dan. Risk and insurance for the 13th of March, and I'll confirm that shortly, but stay tuned. We're just finalising the panel for that. And also we will be doing at least one, possibly two roundtables on fire coming out of the LA fires. We've got a bit of a discussion about that tomorrow. We'll schedule those. So stay tuned and remain part of the this group. There will be a recording available of this as well. But for the final word, our leader and mentor, Dan, any quick final comments in about?
No, I'm the, as they say, the follower. But let me see if I can give a view from the 30,000 feet, 15,000 feet, and the trench hole. Was it the trenches? The big picture, we all realize it's past time for reports and studies. What's needed is not just policy learning, but examples of action. What's come across, among other things here, is that we're in 2025. We all, from our own perspectives, know the ongoing flux of global geopolitical relations. mitigation, greenhouse gas reduction, countries argue about who's responsible. As one of my Chinese colleagues, Xu Tang, says, adaptation should be a win-win. What is being done in Melbourne or Hong Kong or LA, can be something that you can learn from. And as the IPCC says, and all of you have said, governance is key. So what this is part of, what Michael is doing a remarkable, all of you are doing it, how can we begin to put together serious learning, not in the sense of best practices necessarily, because countries are different, but looking in the mirror and seeing yourself through other systems. Felicia has noted that Australia has been very helpful in her thinking. Deb, when I started my work in this, I was asking my colleagues at the National Academy, what have we learned from other countries in public administration? The answer was nothing. You can see why we got problems. Deb said, well, with water engineering, we've learned from the Netherlands. And so this is really a remarkable opportunity. I think Jessica Gordon, I hope I don't get in trouble if you're still there, is at the hub of the longstanding California, China. It's in some ways subnational. The universities, leading universities in Cal, leading for universities in China. And one of our next steps is putting together with Michael and Monash and colleagues, something that will get to the granular level on coastal cities or regions, in contrast to the 100 cities, which Jim mentioned about. 100 cities was city focused, not the region, not the central local. A core thing was adding a resilience officer. So we are the only group, I think, that are looking at this whole picture, and with people globally. And I've gone over time, but Michael, you're all, this is really a pleasure to meet more of you. And say something, Michael, bail me out.
No, it's easy. I think we've had our time. We've asked people for 90 minutes. We've gone a bit over. Thank all of you for your fabulous contributions and participation. Thanks, Kate. I'm hoping that you will be inspired to continue to join us in this journey, and all the rest of you, Ailie and Ben. I'll look forward to meeting you all again in a month and staying in touch. And the recording, Amanda will more than likely put the recording on the NAPA site, and we'll put it on the Monash site. So there will be a recording if you bump into people who missed it and they want to follow up. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Michael, for putting it together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michael.
Thank you.